Jackson, Head of Change for Youth Sector, and you are delightfully welcome to this virtual learning cafe, where we're going to look at youth work in 2029, the youth sector, thinking about vulnerability in 2029. And we're very pleased to be joined by two expert youth sector leaders in Oscar and in Kevin. The format for the session, as you'll know, the party continues unless something major happens with the internet, which is highly possible. But as long as there's a view and there's someone talking, do keep plugging in. The first 20 minutes we'll hear from colleagues. I think Oscar, you're kicking us off, was Kevin? We didn't actually get down yet. So Oscar's happy to kick us off. And then Kevin will follow up with another 20 minutes, and then we'll leave 15 to 20 minutes for some Q&A in that regard. So just hugely massive thanks again for joining us for this session. Let me introduce Oscar as a kickoff, who is the Assistant Director of Research and Impact at UK Youth, overseeing evaluation with specificity on research projects and UK Youth's design team. Oscar focuses on proving and improving the impact of youth work. He ensures that UK Youth develops, tests and scales high quality youth provision and finds the most effective ways to build the capacity and capabilities of its growing cross-sector network. Before joining UK Youth in 2022, Oscar built and led a new evidence and learning team at Comic Relief and started his career as a consultant to the voluntary sector in that regard. So welcome, Oscar, and the platform is yours for the next 20 minutes. Look forward to hearing from you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caleb, and thanks so much to Youth Endowment Fund for having us in and setting up these spaces. Caleb's asked us to consider a few different questions, so I'll try and kind of call those out as I talk through. First of all, why youth work is vital for vulnerable children. And we wanted to kick this off by just kind of how do we actually define youth work. So youth work equips young people to thrive at every stage of their lives. At the core of youth work is the principle that every young person should have a safe space to go that isn't home or school. They should have a trusted adult to talk to that isn't a parent or a teacher. And they should have positive, engaging activities to do in their community as well. So I want you all to kind of take a minute to just think about a vulnerable young person that maybe you're a bit concerned about at the moment. They might be struggling, they might have had difficult experiences throughout childhood, or maybe they're getting caught up in antisocial behaviour and crime. They might be a family friend or someone living near to you. And when my CEO, and Didi, does this with us, and she does it periodically to help us reflect in our roles, I think of young people living on my street in North Croydon, and far too many of them don't have any or all of those things. They don't have a safe space to go that isn't home or school. They don't have a trusted adult to talk to that isn't a parent or a teacher, and they don't have those positive, engaging activities to do in our community. And that's largely because local authority funding for youth provision has been cut by 3/4 since 2010-11. In recent years, the preventative role that youth work plays hasn't been recognised. So there's a really strong moral argument for investing in youth work, but there's also an economic one. Our research, Untapped, found that youth work was saving the taxpayer £3.2 billion in 2022. The return on investment was between £3 and £6 for every £1 invested. So if any of you put £1 in a savings account and you got between £3 and £6 back, I think you'd be a pretty happy customer. The positive outcome that sits across youth work more than any other is the development of young people's socio-emotional skills. So we're talking about things like emotion management, empathy, initiative, problem solving, responsibility, and teamwork. And alongside that, I probably don't need to tell you guys, but different types of youth work do, of course, achieve other really positive outcomes for young people as well, like employability outcomes, like democratic participation and influencing decisions, improved mental health and well-being, diversion away from negative activities in the criminal justice system, and things like greater connection with nature and physical activity as well. So the list goes on, but these are the vital outcomes for young people that we're most focused on at UK Youth. And I think, like, coming back to the theme for this session, why does youth work matter, particularly to the lives of vulnerable children? Well, actually, we believe that youth work matters to all children. You know, there's huge value in young people universally having access to youth work. They can spend time with young people from other backgrounds and with different lived experiences. And let's not forget that young people who have experienced privilege may have also had adverse experiences as well. But all of that said, vulnerable children do have the most to gain from youth work. You know, we hear stories all the time at UK Youth of young people in crisis who haven't just had their lives changed by the relationship with their youth worker, they've had their lives saved by it. And I think an effective youth sector that is joined up with other sectors and agencies is able to identify risks in young people's lives that are often missed by others, and also take the appropriate action to then safeguard and support that young person. Effective youth work improves the support around a vulnerable young person. It builds the young person's skills to meet life challenges head on, and it gives them access to positive and, importantly, really fun activities that can set them on a new course as well. Where youth workers are left kind of plugging gaps from statutory services and funding cuts, they end up working in a much more reactive way. You know, they can't achieve all of those things, and they end up becoming much more focused on just getting a young person through today's crisis rather than setting them up for life. Caleb's also asked us to think about what's working, what isn't, and what changes we want to see. So in terms of what's working in the youth sector, first of all, let's just call out that there's loads of amazing youth work happening across the country, delivered by incredibly committed, highly skilled, hard-working practitioners, meeting or trying to meet the growing scale and complexity of young people's needs. And that's why it's such a privilege to work in this sector and support those practitioners. There are also hundreds of incredible organisations led by brilliant individuals who have weathered storms like the pandemic, the rising cost of living, cuts to funding and workforce challenges. And it's obviously incredibly depressing that many haven't survived, but those organisations that have survived have had to adapt and show incredible resilience. In terms of kind of positive steps in the last few weeks, a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary of State for DCMS, Lisa Nandy, announced that the government is working on a youth strategy, and that's a huge step forward and commits the government to cross-departmental working that doesn't just focus on education, mental health or criminal justice, but looks at the needs of young people in the round. And other Labour policies like plans for young futures hubs are really promising. They're not particularly developed yet, but with the right input, particularly from the charity sector, we know that those can make a really positive difference to young people in local areas. And I think another thing that's working really well is that we now have a much stronger evidence base for youth work as well. You know, we've proven that youth provision achieves positive outcomes for young people that are sustained for decades into adulthood. We know that youth centre closures have a negative impact on young people and communities locally, and we've proven that. We also know that investing in youth provision as a preventative measure makes economic sense. So in terms of what's not working, I've already touched on this, but between 2011 and 2019, the number of open youth clubs across the country nearly halved. That is absolutely massive. There are lots of different types of youth provision, but open access youth clubs embedded within young people's communities are absolutely vital. In research that we're publishing with NCS in the next few weeks, you'll see that this is what youth workers describe as the ideal youth provision. Those youth clubs that are open access welcome young people in, provide a mixture of structured and unstructured activities, but also link young people up with the more targeted opportunities that are right for them. Essentially, open access centre-based youth provision is often the bedrock of the youth sector, and we've been taking away the foundations over the last 12 years. On our kind of unrestricted grants programmes, although they're kind of a drop in the ocean compared to what the youth sector needs, we're seeing that with multi-year unrestricted investment, small and medium-sized youth clubs can become more sustainable and become much more positive about the future of their organisation when they receive that sort of funding. Another big challenge for the youth sector that I'm sure Kev will speak to in a minute is that the youth sector workforce is on its knees. You know, youth practitioners are undervalued, they're underpaid, they're isolated, they're overworked, and they're leaving the profession, often for kind of less fulfilling work, but work that pays the bills and allows them to manage their own well-being as people. And it's not just youth workers that are leaving, but also youth sector leaders, the incredible people who expertly run youth organisations. The problem with this is, amongst other things, if the government turned around tomorrow and put billions into youth work, we wouldn't be close to being able to train and recruit the youth workers to actually deliver it. So we urgently need new and innovative ways of attracting and upskilling the next generation of youth sector professionals. And that's something that UK Youth, NYA, and lots of others are working really hard on. I think the final kind of challenge, and you'll hear me and anyone at UK Youth talk a lot about the need for a step change in how we approach joined up cross-sector working. And if you ask youth practitioners, a lot of them will tell you the same thing as well from their work on the ground. We're still working in this sector in a way that puts young people second and the perceived strengths of our own sector or profession first. So we need a complete rethink of how the sectors that support young people collaborate. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. Caleb's asked us to think about how well does youth work do in supporting Black, Brown and children from other minority ethnic groups? Are there any changes that are needed here? Well, I think the first thing to touch on is just around representation and diversity. Like all the sectors supporting young people, we need more diversity in the youth sector, particularly in leadership positions. Diversity doesn't automatically lead to inclusion, but it is a prerequisite for inclusion. And when leadership in the youth sector is diverse, it'll encourage more diversity in the practitioners entering the sector. You know, as a youth worker, I can be managed or led by someone who understands me and my experience. It becomes a more attractive proposition to someone entering the workforce. And then when the whole youth sector workforce is more diverse, Black, Brown and other racialized young people are then supported by youth workers that look like them and understand their experiences. Young people need those role models and positive, relatable influences on their lives. I think we also need to be recognizing the value that informal youth provision brings. So, for example, lots of amazing provision is happening in religious settings, and not enough is known about that. You know, there's not enough recognition of that as a vital part of the support that many young people receive. There's so much youth work that isn't grounded in religion that can learn from youth work that is grounded in religion, you know, about things like cultural understanding, about morals and values, about how to support whole families and engage the whole family. And we're not making the most of that at the moment. And I think related to that, research, and we're guilty of this at UK Youth, often focuses on paid youth workers, but what about volunteers? You know, what about an informal Saturday sports session that an amazing Black woman has set up to engage the Black kids from her estate and the mentoring that she does with them? We need to make that stuff more visible, more understood, and better supported as well. It's also worth calling out that there are types of youth provision that are disproportionately engaging or attracting white young people, often from more affluent backgrounds. So outdoor learning and adventure activities is a really good example of that. Both the practitioners that are delivering it and the young people that are participating are disproportionately white. And that's starting to change, but it needs a concerted effort. You know, I've heard the phrase, that's just how it is in this sector, and we can be so much more proactive and ambitious than that. To give an example, when there's a Black young person living in an urban setting who hardly even leaves their postcode, the value of being in nature for the first time, away from their worries, challenging themselves by climbing to the top of a tree and getting wet and muddy, it's kind of hard to overestimate the impact that that can have on them and the memories that that creates for them as a person as well. Our Adventures Away from Home programme offered those 1 and 2 day outdoor learning experiences to nearly 13,000 young people last year at really quite low cost. So it's very achievable to offer those sorts of experiences to young people who wouldn't otherwise get them. And I want to talk about the riots, the violence, the racism and the Islamophobia that swept across England and parts of Northern Ireland in August as well. You know, racialized young people were the most victimized. Youth work has a big role to play in giving them a safe, inclusive space to go, a trusted adult to open up to, and also build their skills to be resilient and have the confidence to remove themselves from harmful situations. Excuse me. But then on the flip side, lots of young people got caught up in the rioting as perpetrators, if you like. And we're not sitting here painting them as criminals. The sector told us loud and clear that youth work is critical in promoting young people's democratic participation, critical thinking skills, understanding of those with other experiences and from different backgrounds, and also their online safety. I think another theme here is just around youth voice and ownership. So we're talking about the role of youth work in supporting vulnerable children today, but we're not necessarily hearing directly from young people. Kev and I are obviously really well placed to represent the views of young people and the youth sector. We and our teams are talking to these groups all the time, either informally or formally through our research, but we're not vulnerable young people ourselves, and we're not racialized, and we need to give young people the microphone at every single opportunity. Community buildings is another theme that's worth mentioning. Young people need more ownership of the spaces that they can put their stamp on. I saw this morning that Build Up have put out an open call giving young people a chance to work with designers and builders in London to have more ownership over their own neighbourhoods. I think those sorts of initiatives are really important in terms of space. Last question from me, and I think this is a really important one and really close to my heart, given the role that I do. But what's the role of evidence when it comes to policy and practice of youth work? Well, it's massive. Evidence doesn't just tell us what's effective in supporting young people, but also why it's effective. And at UK Youth, my team evaluates our programs to understand what it is about different types of youth provision that makes them effective. We're increasingly using evaluation to kind of profile the many roles that youth workers play in different contexts. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So on employability programs, how do youth practitioners play a sort of community link worker role? You know, building young people's aspirations and skills for work whilst linking them up with local employers and work experience opportunities. What support do youth workers need to play that role? What's the role that local businesses need to play in that as well? Another example on youth mental health programs. Are youth workers actually effective when they're filling gaps in statutory provision for young people at crisis point, or are they actually much more effective as the constant trusted adult in a young person's life when that young person is finding the right type of therapeutic support for them? Those are sort of some of the evaluation questions that we're answering at the moment. And you can see how you can see what role that can play in informing policy at government level on Labour's plans for Young Futures hubs, for example. I think more broadly, you know, with local authority funding for youth services having fallen by 3/4 over the last 12 years or so, we just need to keep making the moral and economic case for investing in youth work generally. You know, what's been the impact of youth centre closures on young people and local areas? To what extent are the positive outcomes of youth work sustained into later life? What's the return to the taxpayer when the government invests in youth work? It's quite hard to find a reason not to buy into youth work when you look at these pieces of research. But when we talk about evidence and insights at UK Youth, we're also talking a lot about design research these days. And I'll give you a very timely example. Next Thursday, our Joined Up Summit is taking place. It's bringing together some 600 leaders from across sectors and young people, and we're pretty excited about it. It's our first step to reimagining cross-sector collaboration for the professions that work with young people. And off the back of next week's summit in 2025, we'll be kicking off the Joined Up Institute. So that's year-round events, learning and collaboration journeys for cross-sector professionals. And evidence and insight is so critical in designing initiatives like Joined Up. It helps us to understand the enablers and the barriers to collaboration across sectors and how different professionals view each other at the moment. It helps us to understand how spaces at next week's Joined Up Summit can be designed to encourage challenge and relationship building. It's not your standard conference in that respect. Also spotlighting examples of really effective cross-sector working and using that as a stimulus for leaders to reflect and build on during the day. And most importantly of all, design research with young people to inform every element of the summit's design, from setting the big themes of the day to designing the branding. And for any of you lucky enough to be joining us on the day next Thursday, you'll see that young people are leading pretty much every session. So I'm obviously biased because evidence building is everything in my world, but let's look beyond just evaluating how effective youth provision is and answer the questions that will actually change the system around young people. Caleb, how am I doing for time? You had one more question for me, but I don't want to eat into Kev's.
Yeah. No. Go for it. Excellent. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the last one was, what would you like to see Youth Endowment Fund doing? And in 2029, YEF is due to be spent out, and we should be hopeful that the opportunities available to young people and the system around them looks significantly different then to how it does now. But those 5 years are going to go quite quickly, and young people urgently need major systemic shifts. So all of the themes I've discussed over the last few minutes, whether that's racial inequality, cross-sector collaboration, or workforce challenges, are all issues we need to address right now. And I think there are kind of 3 areas where the Youth Endowment Fund has a really important role to play in that. Firstly, although YEF works intentionally across sectors, it is focused on one key end goal, which is reducing youth violence. So YEF needs to be looking at where youth work is different. What are its USPs as compared with, say, formal education or policing? And on the flip side, what are actually commonalities across all of the sectors that work with young people? What can all of those sectors learn? And what practice can they adopt from each other? We all effectively want the same thing for young people, but we still put in place those sector boundaries and lose sight of our commonalities. I think the second thing for YEF is that, I think YEF is currently producing practice guidance that's going to be launched next year, and that's a really amazing opportunity. We're all often a little bit better at building the evidence base of what works than we are at translating it into usable practice and guidance that practitioners can explore and run with. So if an intervention is found to be effective, does an organisation have to adopt that intervention in full? Or are there elements of that effective practice that they can then adopt and build into their work to improve the quality of their provision and young people's outcomes? So I guess my question is, how can Youth Endowment Funds support practitioners to adopt effective practice when they're working with young people in, say, an open access, less structured setting, rather than delivering a more controlled intervention? And I think last point from me, there are probably benefits and challenges for the Youth Endowment Fund in the relationship that it has with central government, particularly the Home Office. That relationship is great for informing policy, but I've talked about the need for practitioners to rethink how they work across sectors. The same applies to governmental departments. So the government's recent commitment to a youth strategy is a great step forward, but what role can Youth Endowment Fund play in supporting the Home Office to look at pooling resource and buy-in from across government departments, health, justice, education, work and pensions? They can all see a significant return when they invest in young people, and we need to be very careful that youth violence isn't just seen as the only or the primary issue to solve.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Oscar. So much there for us to reflect on some of it. There is a tension between youth work's ability to be in many places working with children from a trusted relationship point of view and being an asset within communities, through to the under-resourcing of youth work. Very much a lot of people leaving the industry to find other well-paid, well-meaning jobs in that regard, although the passion still fits and sits with them. If it was paid more and there's more money in the system, more will stay around. And we know that from some of the research that we found, 4,500 less youth workers over the last decade, 40,000 less volunteers. So it's bleak in that regard. And then you've got the element of thinking about racial equality, systemic um, overviews, your point about religious settings who are well placed and have been working long term in a youth work way and how we could learn from them. And, very much when you spoke about the rights, it was very much some of the religious leaders who were able to broker some of um, uh, the things that young people were doing or becoming involved in at that point in time had much more success than usual kind of statutory responses, e.g., policing and etc. And you promoted your own Joined Up Summit, which is coming up, which sounds great, which leads into kind of your focus as UK youth to try and build more evidence in this space and translate that into meaningful products that people like organizations like YEF, but government and others can, and actually practitioners and those within the system can do something relatively well about. And you're pleased to hear the government's focus on having a youth strategy. I mean, you go to Wales and Wales are ahead of the cart completely around this sort of stuff. So maybe the stuff that government can learn from there. But it's great to see that 10 Downing Street held a roundtable with many youth sector leaders to hear more. And the youth futures or young futures hubs could be a way to go. We've seen almost 100 million being invested there, and there's still a lot to work out, and still lots to find out as to what that looks like. But hopefully, you guys are playing in that regard. And then your three asks to us, which are around one is about the practice guidance and in what way can that be really feasible and actionable. Understanding that our position is to not mandate that youth work looks this way because we've looked at the evidence and that's where it should go. And the third part is using our gift of political capital to support the movement in whichever way we can. So excellent. Thank you very much, Oscar. Kevin, it's going to be your turn next. Let me just introduce Kevin. Kevin, I know for quite a while, from the days of me even doing some stuff in Manchester. So Kevin, always really nice to be reunited in that regard. I remember we met first time in Thames. Was it not Tameside? You'll have to remind me.
Yeah, it was Tameside.
Was it?
We met in Trafford and Tameside. Yeah.
Excellent, great.
Yeah.
And so Kevin is the Deputy Director of Youth Work for the National Youth Agency, with responsibility for the workforce, which gives him oversight of the quality assurance processes for youth work qualification and leadership of workforce strategy. He has worked in the sector for about 30 years, both in the statutory and third sector, VCSE or VCFE, and develops particular interest in detached youth work, cross-sectoral approaches, and participation. Currently, he's exploring the youth work relationship and how this can be best utilized for the benefit of young people in local strategy. And I mean, there's no better time than to have that as a key interest. And just before Kevin comes in, colleagues, please do take a moment to just, if you've got questions, please put them in. We'll come round to it. I'll do my best to place them. Would love to hear. You've got two fantastic leaders here to talk to and ask some pertinent questions. Kevin, next 20 minutes is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Caleb. Right, 1428. Thanks, Oscar, as well. It was fascinating, that stuff. And you've said some of the stuff I was going to say, which is good because it means I can go off piste and say some other bits. Caleb introduced me there, talking about my interest in the youth work relationship. And I want to sort of bring that through as a thread through everything I'm saying, really. Because I've found it fascinating, and hopefully in the next 20 minutes I can give you some idea as to why I think it's A, so interesting, but B, so fundamental and important, not just to youth work, but to how youth work interacts at a local and strategic level. So starting with the first question that we had to look at, to do with the definition of youth work. I do. Yeah, so this is going to sound like I'm fudging things, and I'm not, because I came to this conclusion last night after having spent the last couple of years thinking, actually, I know what the definition is. It is to do with relationship. I think that's part of the answer, but I think the answer still always has to be defining youth work is quite a complicated thing to do. And the reason it's a complicated thing to do is because it's a complicated work job. It's a complicated thing. We get involved in young people's lives in a huge variety of ways, and that's part of the nature of it. And I think the relationship is fundamental to that. But I think if you try and define youth work by saying things like it's an educative practice, it's a voluntary relationship, it takes place where young people want to be, all of that sort of stuff misses other important things. And while that sounds like a cop-out, hopefully I can bring it together by talking about the youth work relationship and how I think that kind of bonds all those things together in a way that makes some sense. I started thinking about this when I was in a conversation with a commissioner who was a health service commissioner, actually. And I won't say where, but they were commissioning youth workers to work in mental health crisis teams. Um, and anybody who's had anything to do with mental health knows that young people in crisis are in crisis. They need to go to hospital. They need serious intervention. Their lives are at risk. And this commissioner was commissioning youth workers in 21 different teams around an area. And the intervention was kind of a 72-hour intervention alongside nurses, doctors, psychiatrists, police, social workers, all of those professionals, and youth workers. And I asked why they were commissioning youth workers. I was thinking 21 full-timers. It's quite a resource. And what they said, what they replied was, is for youth workers' engagement skills. Now, I've heard that. I've heard youth work skills, and obviously being looking after the qualifications for youth work, you hear an awful lot about skills. But youth work skills is something we cling on to. But if you scratch the surface of it, there aren't any youth work skills that are unique to youth work. There certainly aren't engagement skills that are unique to youth work. Youth work skills involve communication. Police get better trained in communication than youth workers. Having a degree of empathy, and I'm sure there's nurses who would argue the case that their job is fundamentally based on empathy, otherwise they're not doing it properly. And so all these skills are things that are transferable and aren't things that are unique to youth work. What is unique, though, is the way in which we employ those, the way in which we put them into action. And that's done in such a way as to develop this particular kind of relationship that we know works, we know has impacts, and has certain characteristics. And we've kind of nudged towards this with sort of more recent language around trusted adults. We kind of accept that a trusted adult is a good thing. But again, if you scratch the surface of that, it isn't necessarily. There are plenty of adults that young people get involved with who are trusted to them, who have a really bad influence on those young people's lives, who abuse them, lead them astray, whatever else. And we can all come up with examples of that. Those are trusted adults, but they're trusted adults in relationships with young people that aren't healthy, aren't constructive, and aren't beneficial to anybody. And so I think you need to go a little bit further in defining what the relationship is and what the relationship has in it that we're aiming to work towards when we're forming it. And there's a few things. It's educative. It's about moving young people forward. Now that's important because if you're not moving young people forward, you're just occupying your time. And that's the difference between youth services and leisure services. It's contextual. It looks at young people in the context of their peer groups, their communities, the other organisations that have an impact on their lives or that they have an impact upon. It doesn't just look at young people as individuals. It looks at them within all these contexts and is attendant to both their impact on those contexts and the impact of those contexts on them. And it's one of the only professions to do that. And that's important because if you're interested in a young person's context, if you're asking them about their lives, about how they function at school, about how they function, what's going on on their estate, then not only are you getting valuable information about that young person, but you're taking an interest, you're building the trust, which is one of the characteristics that we want from this relationship. The other things I've got is it's boundaried. Youth work isn't necessarily even friendly. It might not be. It has very strict boundaries around it. And it has to have very strict boundaries around it because it's in this kind of weird sort of space between a professional relationship and a friendly relationship. And so those boundaries are really important, and youth workers need to keep revisiting them, which is why reflective practice is important. So you see, if you look at the youth work relationship as a thing that we need to create that has these characteristics that we see as being favourable and useful, you can see how the way in which we insist on forming that relationship at the speed that young people want to work at, in a way that makes demands of, it's a voluntary relationship because that makes demands of us as workers, about how we interact with young people. If they don't want to be involved in it, if we're not being relevant or engaging to them, they walk away. That makes demands of us as workers. And so all of this sort of context, the things that we're aiming for in the relationship have an influence on how we work and how we must work as youth workers. Another couple of examples I've got, and I won't go into loads more detail about the relationship because it's fun for you to think about in your own time. But a couple of things that are useful, I think, is that it's flexibility. In terms of temporalities, we can work, or we should be able to work with young people over long or short amounts of time, depending on what's necessary for that young person. And they're holistic. We take an interest in every aspect of a young person's life. It's a youth worker's job, if they're invited into any aspect of a young person's life, to have conversations with them about that, within, of course, those professional boundaries, which we need to keep revisiting. That's kind of unique. And if you look at how that applies with work with other sectors, you can suddenly see the use of it. So in schools are bothered about attendance and attainment. 9 times out of 10, problems with attendance and attainment happen outside the school gates. But outside the school gates is quite a weird place for a teacher to be. But it's exactly where a youth worker can and should be. And that's expected by the young person. You're not stepping over your boundaries as a youth worker if you pop up in different places and engage with young people where they are. And also, if you think about it like this is the final sort of axiom that I want to get people to think about. One of the problems and one of the difficulties that I've come across talking to youth workers is this idea that we have to be working with young people where they want to be, and consequently we have to be in centres, or we have to be in purpose-built places for young people. And I'm not entirely sure that's true, because again, if you look at why young people are in those centres, you can guarantee that some of them are there because it's the only safe place to be. Some of them are there because they're being pressured by their peers to be there. So assuming that we only work with young people where they want to be, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. And I much prefer to say that we should be able to work with young people wherever they are. And if you look at youth work like that young people should have the right to access this particular kind of beneficial, trusting, boundaried, contextual relationship wherever they are, then all of a sudden that makes demands of youth work as a sort of strategic input into young people's lives in whatever circumstances they're in. And that brings me on to the next question about why does youth work matter to the lives of vulnerable children? You will all know, I mean, vulnerability could almost be defined by the fact that it's sort of illustrative of a complicated life. It's illustrative of multiple issues, problems, challenges that young people and communities face. And the idea that they can be solved with simple interventions, and without listening and without understanding, and without seeing the interplay between poverty, crime, illness, mental health, whatever else, is a little naive, I think. And so the fact that youth work is relational, and the fact that that relationship is attendant to the context that young people are in, is attendant to the impact of community, the political environment, the social environment, whatever else, places youth work in a way, in a unique position, really, to begin to understand how those different challenges and how those different complexities are interconnected and are interplaying in the lives of young people. And that's a really important function. There's a friend of mine who I'm sure many of you will have heard of, called Graham Tiffany, who articulated that position beautifully by saying that youth workers are privileged witnesses of social reality. And by that, he meant that because we have earned the trust, we worked in the way that we work to gather these relationships, to create these relationships, we're then privileged to be allowed into the lives of the young people we're working with, in the spaces that they're inhabiting, in their neighbourhoods, in their youth centres, in their schools, in their prisons, and also into their thoughts. You know, they do. One of the things that's common to youth workers will tell you stories that they get disclosures, they get information about young people that isn't disclosed to other professions, and that's partly because we're trusted, partly because we're present, we're there when these disclosures are being made, and partly because part of the job and part of the formation and maintenance of the relationship is to allow young people and to encourage young people the space to think these things through and to poke them a bit and to say, well, okay, have you thought about it like this? To encourage critical thinking. But all of that creates this environment where we're party to detailed, rich, the prescient information about young people and young people's lives. And that's really important, and it's unique to youth work. So in terms of working with vulnerable young people, having those professionals with that function to develop these relationships, to be able to garner that information, to understand these multiple complexities and how they interplay, alongside the people who are travelling through them, strikes me as being something so valuable that we can't ignore it, and should be built into local strategy wherever possible. So that brings me on to kind of what's working well and what isn't working well at present in the provision for youth work with vulnerable children. And I'll put my workforce hat on. There are several sort of good things and bad things about how youth work works with matters to the sort of works with vulnerable children. But one of the issues that we have is an inconsistency across the youth work landscape in terms of where provision is, how good provision is, all of that. The workforce side of that is interesting to look at. So I'm going to give you some statistics about it. We think there are about 21,200 paid youth workers in the workforce in England today. Probably another 14,000 who are volunteers. Of those, we think there are somewhere in the region of 4,200, 4,300 with a professional youth work qualification, that's level 6 or above, and a further 4,100, 4,200, maybe 4,500 actually. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I'm guessing. 4,500 with a level 3 qualification. So if you look at the workforce as a whole, including the voluntary sector, the people who are volunteering, that's almost 3/4 of the people who are working every day with these young people who haven't got any training in youth work. And that's a problem for a few reasons. One of the reasons is if you're not trained in youth work and you don't understand what it is and you're not thinking about it all the time, then you may not be doing it very well. You may be doing it for the wrong reasons. Or you may be doing it and thinking you're doing a great job, but you may not really understand sort of that function of developing a relationship that has these particular characteristics. And there's loads and loads of examples of this. We've seen, there's youth projects that appear with people who don't have any training qualification, who mean really, really well. And then you hear horror stories, not necessarily in all of them. Some of them do a fantastic job, but people place themselves as role models, and they realise that their experience is very different to that of the young people, and so it's been damaging. So all of that sort of stuff and those processes that you have to go through, that you get through youth work training, I think are really useful. And the fact that most people who work with young people as youth workers aren't trained, I think is something we need to question and work with. So that's an issue, the workforce thing. The other thing is because of that, because there's a lack of trained staff, the landscape in terms of delivery is changing enormously. So the other statistics we have about employers are that the entry-level salary into youth work is round about £21,000, but that splits. It's kind of £26,000 at management level, £19,000 at entry level. This is from the survey that we did of vacancies in May. There were 175 vacancies. Of those, I think it was 14% were asking for a qualification as essential or desirable. 5% were paying on J&C terms and conditions. And so the landscape of employment isn't requiring that people who work with young people are trained as youth workers. Now, if you speak to employers, we need to do more research on this. Some of that is because they can't afford to pay at the levels that they're required to pay someone with a degree. Some are because it's very, very difficult to get qualified youth workers, and they're employing to values and aptitude and training people up themselves. And fine, I think that's great. But we don't know is the reason why. But the damage that's having is that in terms of the workforce as a system, it means that there's fewer incentives for people to get training. The pay for youth workers at £19,000 doesn't really justify them getting a degree for £27,000. And so we're in this kind of downward spiral where skills aren't being gained, therefore skills aren't being required, therefore people aren't seeking skills out because they don't need them to get the employment they need. And that's something, if youth work is to take its place alongside the other sectors in local strategy, is something that we need to break, because we need workers who understand that role of youth work and understand where it fits in. So that's not working very well. The workforce stuff isn't working very well, and we need to address it. The other thing that's changed enormously in the last few years, last 10 or 15 years, and I've always been an optimist about youth work, but this is something that I can't get away from, is that the actual physical landscape for delivering youth work, not the roads and whatever else, but the organisations that deliver youth work have changed enormously. It used to be that 3/4 of youth work in the country was delivered by local authorities. It's now 3/4 delivered by the voluntary sector. Nothing wrong with the voluntary sector. The voluntary sector, I'm on the board of a voluntary sector organisation, and they're absolutely outstanding. The difficulty is what that creates in terms of a delivery landscape is competition. So in Manchester, where I am, we don't have a local authority youth service, but we have 40 or 50 voluntary sector youth providers. They're all going for the same funding. They're all in competition for the same funding, and consequently, they all have to say to funders that they're doing something different from each other, because they need to carve out their own niche. And in some ways, that's a little performative. What it means is that they start defining themselves as arts organisations or mental health organisations rather than youth work organisations, and in doing so, they lose the ability to articulate that function of youth work as a relational practice and the benefits that go along with it. And so again, if you want to involve youth work in local strategy and you've got 40 different organisations who aren't saying they're doing the same thing, that's problematic. And that's a change that we've had over the past 10 or 12 years that's structural, that we need to organise. We need to find a way of coordinating services and recognising that whether you're in arts, mental health, whatever else, the core function, the thing that enables you to do your work is this relational practice and the benefits it brings. So that's not working too well. What is working though is there is some excellent practice. There's some fantastic examples of youth work working with vulnerable children in a way that's helpful, progressive, and fits in with the allied sectors. And there are examples of that all over the country. Salford Youth Service is fantastic. It's embedded fully into mental health, physical healthcare, education, social care. Has been able to articulate what it does and how it engages with those young people and how it can be useful to the other services. So in some areas, youth work is doing a great job with vulnerable people. But it's a bit of a lottery, depending on what the landscape is like, depending on what the delivery landscape is like, and depending on how the staff are there. So that's interesting, and that's also something that we need to organise. We need to look at local coordination. We need to look at articulating the role of youth work. And we need to ensure that staff themselves, youth workers themselves, whatever level they're at, understand how their role is unique and how their role contributes.
And Kevin, just for time, you probably want to land now at the 3 big asks or that you might have for YEF, just to leave time for questions, because I'm sure lots of questions.
Yes, of course.
So it's been a masterclass so far, by the way, as well. Just as
the 3 big asks are, well, I've got an ask for youth workers, which I think YEF can magnify, and that's, I think, youth workers, because of this privileged access we have, because of this privileged relationship we have with young people, that comes with responsibilities and duties. And those responsibilities, because we're in a space that we've been allowed into, and you know, we're honoured to be done so. And the duty we have is we need to realise that means we need to get trained. We need to continue improving our practice. We need to reflect on it, and we need to continually engage in that throughout our career. The other thing that youth workers have a duty to do is to step to other services and communities explaining how youth work works. And we need to go to them saying, this is the function we can perform, and we're equals with you, and we can support your service, and we can augment it. But we've got a duty to do that because those services have an impact on young people's lives. And you know, if we're contextual and we're working with young people in their neighbourhoods, in the context of their services, then they need us to be saying that so that those services understand. And those things are things that YEF can help articulate going forward. YEF's worked in some very, very difficult neighbourhoods and done some research in some very, very difficult neighbourhoods, and I think understands the complexities of those areas.
Mm.
And so because of the research that YEF's done, and because of the voice that YEF has and the influence that YEF has with government and with policymakers, magnifying those asks, those challenges, saying we need a skilled workforce, and articulating the function of youth work as a relational practice that can augment other practices and comes with the benefit of information and the ability to offer challenge and have it accepted and stuff, are the main asks for YEF.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin.
Sorry
Thank
if I
you,
rambled.
Oscar. No. The masterclass, both masterclasses, loud and clear on particularly the work, the temperature and position and opportunity for the workforce as a key component here. Well, we're going to open up for questions. Oscar, just so you know, your cat's completely trolled you. This whole webinar has been set alight by the black cat who was walking across your screen. We're going to open up for questions. So if you'd like to ask one, just as you know, just hit the raise button in the Teams software platform, whatever it is, dashboard, and let's get it going. I'll give you a moment just to give people a chance before I'll be happy to answer. Oh, Claire, I have 4 questions here, so it's good you jumped in. So, Claire, go ahead.
You. Yeah, I'm Claire Charlton. I'm a advanced public health practitioner actually in Worcestershire, and we commission our youth services through public health, which is probably a little bit different from other local authorities. I'm very interested to know if we know anything more about the new government's plans for the Young Futures hubs, how those will operate. Do we know anything more than we know, or that's been shared so far?
Not I mean, from YEF point of view, not relatively much more.
Okay.
Still very much. I mean, Oscar, Kevin, do you want to come in on this if you know more of a scoop? No.
We don't know anything you don't know, Caleb, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know, we tap into different parts of government, but there's not much more we can really say apart from it's still a work in progress. I think they've still got lots to work out, and we're playing in the best we can about the best way to be to utilize our evidence to do some of that stuff, and that's as far as I can go. Yeah, Kevin.
Okay.
Just to say, we are articulating the importance of youth work as a discrete practice in amongst the youth hubs. I don't, and you know, we have quite a close relationship with DCMS, and they understand what youth work is, and they understand what we're talking about when we say it, and so they're fighting the corner for us as well. But yeah, in terms of what their plans are, they're still planning, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for that. That's useful.
Excellent.
I might just come in as well.
Yeah, go Oscar.
Yeah.
Go
we don't know any more than anyone else, obviously, but I know there are lots of concerns in the youth sector about the kind of linkage through the Young Futures hubs of employability, mental health, and youth violence, and those 3 things don't always naturally sit well together, of course, but I think we also need to think about where they can sit well together. And this is not about me plugging UK Youth's work, but we're currently running a summer jobs programme. We've just finished the first year, and it happens to be supported by the Youth Endowment Fund. And that does bring together employability and kind of youth violence outcomes through one program. So I think we do need to kind of think about how these different outcomes can fit together, and we obviously need to work with the government on making sure that whatever comes out of the Young Futures hubs is sensible in terms of what intentional youth work looks like to achieve those three outcomes, and where different typologies, youth work typologies, can and can't kind of be fitted together through the Young Futures hubs as well.
Yeah, we don't want to lose the value of our universal youth clubs, youth organisations that are delivering on the ground, because they're then having to focus very much on a specific area, because we lose the preventative nature of the universal delivery, which is something from a public health perspective we see a huge value in. So that's useful perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, well said, Claire. And there's a real tension there as well. And we'll continue to push. And we've got 4 questions. So I'm going to go round, get the questions, and then give the speakers a couple of minutes each to come 5 questions. So is it Dehania or Thomas? I think it's Thomas. Do you want to ask your question quickly?
Dehania?
Yes, hello.
Hi, great.
Dehania, yes.
I'm from Reach Out, and I have a question. It's kind of a bit aimed at Kevin, just with what you were saying with the landscape changing. Do you anticipate the landscape of youth work ever reverting back to being maybe equal or less dominated by the voluntary sector, and with local authorities maybe in the next 5 years taking a bit of a step up and increasing from maybe 25% to 35 or 40, given the government's kind of recent kind of push towards youth work?
Good question. Excellent.
Yeah,
we'll go around, Kevin, and then we'll come back. Is that all right? Just so we can get all the questions in. All right. Nicholas.
Hi, everyone. I'm just wondering how youth work is responding to the rising populism and the far right, which we're seeing amongst, certainly amongst the adolescent male population and sort of mid to late teenagers. So I'm just wondering what support and training and interventions youth work is really focusing on to sort of quell those. When Oscar was speaking about the riots earlier on, we have people that are drawn into them, but we also have young people who are starting to, in my work with young people, I often see males feeling disenfranchised across the ethnic, minoritized ethnic young people and white young people as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's Dylan next. Dylan.
Hello. Yeah. Kind of building on what Dehania asked. I work in Stockport, and as a youth engagement officer, and I've kind of experienced that there's a lot of disparate programs going on at the minute, and people aren't really working together. So kind of building on that, I don't know if Kevin has any recommendations as to how the third sector can actually collaborate better.
Unite. Excellent. Thank you. Simon.
Thank you. I'd be just interested to hear from our speakers in terms of the supply line of that youth workforce. So my comment is in there around having to essentially start with people with experience of working with young people rather than people with experience of youth work, and how we might rebuild that, and where there's any innovative work around some of that, because I think it's been really eye-opening for me recruiting large numbers of youth workers, but really only being able to recruit, I think we've got 4 JNC qualified level 6 youth workers across a system of 26, and just not getting applicants even at our senior youth work posts.
Wow. Thank you, Simon. Nicola, last question.
Hi, I'm probably a little bit different from a lot of people here, but I'm an adoptive parent of a very vulnerable child who has had in his background a lot of adverse childhood experiences, and more recently has been involved with criminal exploitation and knife crime. And he has engaged or tried to engage with youth practitioners, but it's been quite difficult for him to engage. He's very distrusting of people just in general. He has quite difficult experiences with a lot of people who work in different professions, particularly think people like social workers. And I kind of wanted to sort of hear people's views on how trauma-informed practice could be applied to youth work.
Right, I'll see if I can take that one. So let's go, Kevin. Let's go with you first. Reverting back to previous LAs versus VCS. and also responding to disparate programs. How do you unite the sector? Maybe unite the sector. Oscar, you answered that. And then the second question about responding to popularism in kind of far right type movement and young people. So you kick off with that, Kevin. This is recorded, so if you've got to drop off, please come back and watch it. All right, so Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for it was a very good question, and I mean the short answer is I don't know. I can't personally, I can't see a move back to a majority local authority provision, simply for the reason that local authorities haven't got as much money as they used to have, and that doesn't look like it's changing anytime soon. Having said that, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. There are loads and loads of extremely good third sector providers. The difficulty is with the coordination, as far as I can tell. So the solution to that, I think, is in part the best solution we've got at the moment, or there's two possible solutions. One is, and this is something we're really pushing, the new guidance for the statutory duty for local authorities. The guidance used to be 3 pages long. There is a statutory duty for local authorities. They have to ensure the provision of youth services. We've recently managed to get that changed to sort of somewhere in the region of 30 pages long. And it's very clear about the responsibilities of local authorities. They have to have youth work as part of local strategy. They have to engage the voluntary and third sector in that. They have to have a workforce plan, whatever else. They still haven't got any money, so it's not going to happen overnight. But at least the guidance is there, saying what it is they should be doing, and we agree with it. They should have, if they can't provide youth service themselves, then they're an obvious candidate for that convener role, and they're also responsible for much of the other interventions with young people, and so they're an obvious player to involve young people in local strategy. So I'm confident that that's a big step forward, and I'm really pleased with that bit of work. The other, I mean, there's some other interesting work going on from the voluntary sector. So things like Young People's Foundation trusts performing that function, or could perform that function of bringing together the third sector. And they have been doing that across the country. And there's examples of them bringing together third sector organisations to get them into a better position for dealing with commissioning and larger contracts. And so that's something that we want to help and support and encourage as well. So that kind of addresses the disparate programs stuff too. It's they look to the local authority to say they've got a role in doing this, but also as a third sector, you know, there are ways you can come together if the local authority isn't able to help. And there's plenty of examples of those. Did you want me to look at the far right one as well, or is that for Oscar to? You're muted, Caleb.
That's annoying, isn't it? Let me go to Oscar. It's just to talk about kind of what you're doing in the summit, and bringing people together, because that was one of the questions. So yeah, how can the third sector come together? Leading on from Kevin's point there.
Yeah, to be honest, I think I've kind of talked about it a fair bit, and I'd love to focus on the other two questions. Sorry to overrule you, Caleb, just because I've already talked about kind of joined up and cross-sector collaboration. So one of the questions was on the rising populism and far right, and obviously youth workers have to be very careful. They cannot say to a young person, okay, this content is right-wing content, therefore you should not engage with it. Youth work is all about supporting young people to develop their own critical thinking skills. And during the riots in August, we came together with the National Youth Agency and the Network for Regional Youth Work Units, and we put on Space to Connect sessions where we listened to youth workers and the experience they were going through, and we had hundreds of people in some of those sessions. And some of the messaging around this from youth practitioners was like, this doesn't need a new response from the youth sector. This is what youth work does. And there were kind of memories of youth workers being in schools and how much more effective it was to promote democratic participation when youth workers could do that in a school environment with young people. But we just need to focus on the power of youth work in supporting young people to digest online content and what they see in the media. And also, as Kev spoke to earlier, those kind of adults they see as being trusted in their lives who actually aren't particularly trustworthy, or are feeding them kind of misinformation themselves. Misinformation and disinformation doesn't always come from online sources. Sometimes it comes from the people closest to you in a home, in a school, on the street. So I think youth work plays a really important role in that, but it doesn't mean like completely ripping up the rule book and focusing on right-wing and populist media. It just needs to focus on what youth work does really well. The second question I wanted to quickly come to, Caleb, if you don't mind, was just on the supply line of the youth workforce. And the question was about, are there innovative approaches to this? And there are several, but one thing that UK Youth's working on at the moment is what we're calling Youth First. And we are going to be running this with a small cohort over the next 2 years. We'll be really robustly evaluating it, and we'll be looking to scale that. And it's not just looking to kind of bring in the next generation of youth workers, it's looking to bring in the next generation, a diverse generation of youth sector leaders with the skills to work across sectors and truly impact the system around young people, as opposed to just delivering kind of on the ground youth provision. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we think it's really important that the youth sector workforce is supported from the leadership level, and we'll be working really hard to make sure that we've got an effective programme that can be delivered at scale in order to meet the needs of the sector in terms of the workforce crisis.
Excellent. Well, we're definitely over time, but it's been well worth it. If you've stayed behind, you get a bit of a snippet about what's happening at YEF. Look out for the Children's Violence and Vulnerability Report. It will talk about young people in youth clubs. Who are they? Very interesting things to come out of that. We've got the practice guidance coming out, which is about what sorts of things, actionable things that colleagues in across commissioners and delivery organisations should do when we're thinking about the evidence in reducing youth violence. And the system guidance comes about later. But sign up to our newsletter, and we'll do a wraparound. And that's the best way to hear about what's coming up next. Summer Jobs is the next virtual learning cafe in the youth sector space here at Youth Endowment Fund. That's in February. You'll hear from Oscar's team around that, who are doing a fab job. Some really interesting insights that would be shared. And on top of that, just a huge thank you for joining us today. We hope you've had a great time listening. And if you need to get in touch with these two wonderful organizations and two leaders, please do so. I know I can see some of you want some consultation here and now. We didn't get to properly answer the question from Nicola. So Nicola, do reach into colleagues here and they might be able to put you in touch with like brilliant practitioners who can give you much more of an ear and some response in that regard. But in terms of trauma-informed practice, the actual evidence base for that right now is we just don't know its effectiveness. So we're actually testing that, but it will take a while for that to come through as a whole. All the very best and have a good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.